From the other Marines in the barracks, Og gathered that Oswald had deliberately shot himself to get himself transferred before the unit departed from Japan. All Oswald said at the time, according to several witnesses, was, "I believe I shot myself." Hello, you guys. Welcome back to my channel. And if you're new, then welcome. I'm Jess, Connell, and I would love to earn your subscription with this video. Today, we are in part 3 of JFK Circling the Truth, meaning we are honing in on the JFK assassination through a variety of assassination books, and not only assassination related books. I will say, like, there are a few that are not exclusively focused on the assassination, but they give us pieces of information that we need about the assassination or to properly understand a particular character in the assassination. So today's, however, is centered on someone you will know very well. It is called Legend: The Secret World of Lee Harvey Oswald by Edward J. Epstein. And this book, we actually just spoke about it in a recent episode, like last week, because he was the person that George de Mohrenschildt was actively interviewing with when his life ended, and it ended under very suspicious circumstances. But he was in what was supposed to be day 2 of 4 interviews, 4 days of interviewing that he had planned to do with Edward J. Epstein for this book. But we are going to read a selection today that gives us a little peek into an area of Lee Oswald's life that I certainly haven't heard a ton about, and I wonder if you have. It's something that they tried to downplay. I think they focused the attention of the world on Lee Oswald's defection to Russia and tried to make him like a turncoat who couldn't hack it in the Marines, couldn't really hack it in America, was just kind of moving from job to job. What a loser. But when you look closer into the details, you find something very different. You find a Marine who had been trained and given access to U-2 spy plane information. We are going to jump into this book in what is chapter 2. It's called The Queen Bee. And so you can see where it falls in the book. I'm telling you that because, of course, we are not going to read everything in this book. We are reading a selection of different pieces of literature. And so one of the wonderful things about this series is that we are going to get to familiarize ourselves with a little bit of the tone and the research quality of a variety of books. So here is Edward J. Epstein's book, Legend: The Secret World of Lee Harvey Oswald, chapter 2. It's called The Queen Bee. To Oswald, who had had a peripatetic life almost from the time he was born, the move to Japan presented new opportunities. For one thing, his position as a radar operator at Atsugi gave him a standing that he had lacked as a truant and a high school dropout. Oswald was assigned to work in the radar bubble located at the northern end of the mile-long runway. On his watches, Oswald, like the other men on the crew, rotated jobs. For 4 hours at a time, they would alternate peering into their crystal balls, i.e. their radar scopes, plotting intercepts at the plotting board, and monitoring radio communications with pilots. Their sector of responsibility was from 270 to 360 degrees on the azimuth of their radar scopes, which took in the area from the South China Sea to Korea. They were supposed to direct friendly planes toward their destinations through the use of radar and to spot enemy planes and then alert the Tactical Air Control Center at Iwakuni, Japan, which would then dispatch interceptor planes. They also served as communication liaisons with the Japanese Air Defense Forces and monitored the air traffic approaching Tokyo. We're not given a year that this is. Let me just look at it really fast. Okay, looking back at the last chapter, we're told that In 1957, in January, he had completed his basic training and went to Infantry Training Regiment at Camp Pendleton, which is 20 miles north of San Diego. So he had been there in January of 1957. In March, after a brief leave, he visited his mother and he reported to Florida. In August 21st, they boarded the USS Bexar, I think people say, even though in Texas we call this Behar, Bexar in San Diego, and they steamed out to the Pacific. So that was August 21st. So it looks like we are in 1957, just for yours and mine certainty in the matter. When Oswald moved to the plotting board, he prided himself on the meticulous paths he drew and bristled at a young Tab Hunter type officer who tried to second guess his plotting or to correct him. He also showed a keen interest in the briefings on classified material, which were held by the unit's intelligence officer. His supervisor, Captain Francis J. Gajewski, duly noted in Oswald's record 6 months after he came to Atsugi, "As a matter of fact, Oswald has done good work for me. I would desire to have him work for me at any time. He minds his business and he does his job well." Okay, that is someone who knew Oswald for 6 months, doing a job immediately after. And we're told that he bristled when somebody corrected him. So I was prepared to actually hear the opposite type of report. But this is like, no, as a matter of fact, he's done good work for me. I would desire to have him work with me again. The other men on the enlisted crew who spent all-night watches with Oswald also found that no matter how they provoked him, he refused to talk much about himself. They continued to pry to find out if he was a cherry virgin or if he had found a girlfriend, but he warded away both queries and insults with an odd type of half-smile that some took to be a sneer. Sometimes during a long stretch in the bubble, he would mimic Bugs Bunny, wiggling his ears, squinting his eyes, and extending his teeth over his lip, earning him the nickname Bugs. When a blip appeared on the scope, however, he would quickly return to it. We are getting a side of Oswald I've never heard. I'm really glad to be reading this with you. Like most of the other privates and corporals in the 117-man Max 1 unit, Oswald lived in a wooden 2-story barracks near the east gate of the base. His roommate was Corporal Thomas Bagshaw, a career Marine. Bagshaw remembers Oswald when he arrived at Atsugi as very thin, almost frail, shy, and quiet. He also recalls feeling sorry for him when other Marines in the barracks began picking on him. The rougher Marines in the barracks, who generally preferred spending their liberties carousing in Japanese bars and finding women, considered Oswald, who spent his early liberties in the television room of the barracks alone, watching American Bandstand and replays of football games, a natural object of derision. They called him Mrs. Oswald, threw him in the shower fully dressed, and hassled him in every other conceivable way. Oswald would not fight back. He would just turn away from a provoker and ignore him. I have to say that is a very different picture from who we were given. Ruth and Michael Paine particularly described Oswald as sort of like itching for a fight, like a little man who just couldn't let a fight go and who always wanted to be kind of argumentative and petty and right. This is a different posture. Now, it's possible this was just his posture post-training, that was the way he had gotten through with drill instructors or something, but this is interesting. It gives us a picture of Oswald as a restrained man who was willing to take provocation, was jokey with his peers, was a little bit like, hey, don't correct the way I do something, but that was a pleasant guy to work with. Not all of the Marines in the barracks approved of this razzing of Oswald. Zach Stout, who had interrupted his high school education and joined the Marines with a group of his friends, found Oswald both interesting and likable. He recalls that Oswald was honest and blunt, and that's usually what got him into trouble. He also found Oswald one of the few men in the unit with whom he could hold an intelligent conversation and who read serious books. Ozzy would read deep stuff like Mein Kampf or The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, and he tried to interest Stout in some of these histories. He was particularly impressed by the way Oswald articulated issues. His diction was good. He used his hands when he talked, and he seemed to think about what he was going to say, Stout recalled. He was absolutely truthful, the kind of guy I'd trust completely. Wow. When Stout began going on leaves with Oswald, he also found that he was seemingly well informed about politics. As far as the other Marines went, Stout explains, Ozzy treated people as they treated him. And if he couldn't, for some reason, he'd ignore them. Another Marine who befriended Oswald at Atsugi was George Wilkins, a worldly recruit from upstate New York who had traveled much of the Western Hemisphere with his father on business trips. Wilkins recalls, Ozzy reacted to most of the crap by looking at you with that half grin on his face. He could sympathize with Oswald in resenting the authority of young officers just out of college. He says, hell, we all thought we were smarter and better than any of the officers, and Ozzy was just like the rest of us. We all resented authority. Okay, so there were young men who had not gone to college, that had gone through training at Camp Pendleton, and then there's these young officers who are getting out of college but haven't gone through the razzing and the training and the things at base like these young Marines, and so they resented it, which totally makes sense. As he's describing this half grin, I'm thinking about have y'all seen the smile that Oswald does that is like a little kind of like an open mouth grin? But it makes me think of that. When Oswald showed an interest in photography, Wilkins, himself a photography buff, spent some time teaching him how to use a 35mm camera. Oswald then bought an Imperial reflex camera and walked around the sprawling base, taking pictures of the various objects that apparently interested him, such as the radar height-finding antennas. Gator Daniels, who first got to know Oswald aboard the USS Bexar on his way to Japan, had been christened Godfrey Jerome, but his Marine buddies quickly stuck him with the nickname reflective of his reputation as an alligator wrestler, Gator Daniels. A giant of a man, Daniels had rarely been out of the swamps of Florida, where he had helped his father fish and trap before enlisting at the age of 18. Gator immediately took a liking to Oswald. He recalls, he was simple folk, just like I was. We were a bunch of kids, never been away from home before, but Oswald came right out and admitted he had never known a woman. It was real unusual that a fellow would admit that. Like me, he was naive about a lot of things, but he never was ashamed to admit it. Daniels, who was greatly admired by the other Marines in the unit, including at least one officer, took Oswald under his wing and tried to help him when he could. He was just a good egg, Daniels remembers. He used to do me favors, like lending me money until payday. He was the sort of friend I could count on if I needed a pint of blood. Good grief! These descriptions that this one guy's like, he was absolutely truthful, super intelligent, honest, blunt. You could hold an intelligent conversation with him. His diction was good. And then this guy saying he had never been away from home before. He was humble, naive. He was just a good egg. This is an entirely different picture. Again, I just find myself so glad we're reading this. He also came to admire Oswald's innate intelligence. He had the sort of intelligence where you could show him how to do something once and he'd know how to do it, even if it was pretty complicated. Oswald had now found at Atsugi a camaraderie with a group of men that he had never experienced before. They encouraged him to drink with them in the local bars around the base and laughed with him whenever he would come back drunk, waking up his barracks mates to shout, "Save your Confederate money, boys! The South will rise again!" They also introduced him to the vast array of cheap bars near the base and the girls who worked in them. From Neon Rise to Neon Set, the bars served as bargain basement brothels for enlisted men from the base, and they cheered him on when he finally had his first sexual experience with a Japanese bar girl. They took Oswald to Yokohama with them on their Cinderella liberties, so called because they had to be back on base at a prescribed hour in the middle of the night, usually midnight. In Yamato, on the outskirts of the base, they turned the Bluebird Cafe into a squadron hangout and jeered at sailors or airmen who strayed in. While Oswald did not yet gamble himself, his newfound friends considered him moralistic in that respect. He did sit up all night watching them play poker. There were times, however, when Oswald would disappear to Tokyo on a 2-day leave and refuse to discuss these trips with even his closest friends. Years later, in Dallas, he confided to a close associate that he had become involved with a small circle of Japanese communists in Tokyo while in the Marines. If this was in fact true, none of the Marines Oswald served with had any inkling of the double life he was living, at least at the time. Zach Stout knew of only one possible piece in the puzzle of Oswald's absences. He seems to have fallen in love, perhaps for the first time in his life, with a Japanese girl. When Stout asked where she worked, Oswald told him that she was a hostess at the Queen Bee in Tokyo. This, in itself, was extraordinary. The Queen Bee, known for its more than 100 strikingly beautiful hostesses, was then one of the 3 most expensive nightclubs in Tokyo. It catered to an elite clientele, field-grade officers, pilots, including U-2 pilots, and a few junior officers with private incomes, not to impoverished Marine privates. To take a hostess out of a nightclub customarily required paying not only the girl but the nightclub as well for the bar business it lost during her absence. The man also had to pay for the accommodations for the evening. For an evening at the Queen Bee, a date could cost anywhere from $60 to $100. So he's got this connection with a Japanese girl, he says, that would cost anywhere from $60 to $100. Yet Oswald, who was earning less than $85 a month take-home pay, went out with this woman from the Queen Bee with surprising regularity, even bringing her back to the base area several times. He was really crazy about her, observed Stout, who met the woman with Oswald on several occasions in local bars around the base. Other Marines, less friendly to Oswald and who saw him with a woman, were astonished that someone of her class would go out with Oswald at all. So there is multiple sightings of her with him. So this is not just a brag on his part. They're seeing them together. And it costs $60 to $100 every time they're together. Something else is going on. He's not just living on $85 a month, and he had no money from his childhood. He was not privately wealthy. Stout and other men remember that these clubs were frequented by officers, and one could pick up useful bits of information about where the unit was headed. It seemed to him that you could always find out where you were going from a bar girl before you could find out on base. According to one source, Navy intelligence was also interested in the possibility that hostesses from the Queen Bee were being used at the time to gather intelligence, and that Oswald was receiving money from someone at the Queen Bee. Just about the time that Oswald celebrated his 18th birthday on October 18, plans were made for the entire unit to ship out to the South China Sea and the Philippines. The civil war in Indonesia was heating up, and the U.S., which had up to this point only secretly supported the Muslim generals against President Ahmed Sukarno through the CIA, was now considering an overt intervention, which would possibly require a Marine landing in Borneo. To provide support, Max 1 was scheduled to leave within weeks. Oswald seemed very unhappy at the prospect of leaving Japan. Stout assumed that this was because Oswald was having trouble with his hostess from the Queen Bee, who he told Stout was now going out with a buck sergeant when he had to report back for duty at the end of his Cinderella liberties. On October 27th, the moment for departure drew near. At about 8:30 p.m., Oswald grazed his upper left arm with a .22 caliber bullet. I've heard about this and wanted to learn more, so now we get to. Which he had fired from a Derringer he had somehow obtained in Japan. Wilkins rushed into the barracks at the sound of the explosion and saw Oswald quietly sitting on the lower bunk of his double-decker, still holding the pistol in his right hand. Wilkins could see a trace of blood on Oswald's left arm, but the wound did not look serious. Only a few weeks before, Oswald had shown him the silver-plated 2-shot Derringer and told him that he had ordered it from a mail-order firm in the United States. Knowing that it was illegal for enlisted men to have private firearms, Wilkins turned and left the barracks as others rushed in. So he didn't want to be the one to find him because he didn't want to get in trouble for knowing, I guess. Robert Royce Ogg, whose bed Oswald was sitting on, came in just as a Navy corpsman was tying a tourniquet on Oswald's arm. From the other Marines in the barracks, Ogg gathered that Oswald had deliberately shot himself to get himself transferred before the unit departed from Japan. All Oswald said at the time, according to several witnesses, was, "I believe I shot myself." In any case, Oswald was rushed to the U.S. Navy hospital in nearby Yokosuka, where a Navy surgeon treated the wound. The official medical report of the incident, signed by Dr. R.S. Guthrie, stated initially that Oswald had shot himself by accident when he dropped a .45 caliber automatic pistol and it discharged. This apparently was what Oswald had reported, rather than reveal that he had his own .22 caliber pistol, which was a court-martial offense. Later, the missile was examined and found to be a .22 caliber bullet. The incident was duly reported, and he now faced military discipline. For nearly 3 weeks, Oswald recuperated in the hospital. Despite his apparent desire to remain behind in Japan, Oswald was discharged from medical treatment just in time to rejoin his unit. So it didn't even achieve the purpose. On November 20th, with the rest of the men from Coffee Mill, he boarded a rickety World War II LST, the USS Terrell County, and steamed out of the port of Yokosuka, bound for the northern end of the Philippine archipelago. The maneuver was codenamed Operation Strongback. Hitting the Philippine beaches in their amphibious trucks, as if it were an actual invasion, the Marines drove nearly 20 miles inland, where they set up a temporary radar control bubble, which was actually a tent. While waiting for their heavier equipment to arrive, the Marines set about exploring the countryside. Encountering a group of local people feasting on pork and dog meat, they offered to trade them government blankets for their knives. The natives gave them a locally fermented green beer. And as the Marines made approaches to their women, a brawl nearly broke out. The Marines were forced to retreat back to their camp. James R. Bud Persons, a young Mississippian who used to enjoy these foraging experiences, became acquainted with Oswald during this period. Oswald was easy to get along with, he recalls. He was quiet. He didn't have a fight in him. He was not one of those animal-like guys. Didn't have a fight in him. Less than a week after it set up its forward camp, Coffee Mill was ordered to strike its tents and proceed immediately back to the USS Terrell County. Once loaded, the LST headed north towards Japan, and the men assumed they were returning to Atsugi. An unfortunate monkey, taken aboard by one of the Marines, had to be dumped overboard once they were underway because the officers suspected it as a disease carrier. On the second day at sea, however, the ship veered around sharply and headed back to Subic Bay in the Philippines. For a week, the ship simply sat in the bay, no hint being given to the Marines as to their future destination. This is one of the things that my own Marine has talked about, that sometimes you just have no idea what's going on as a Marine, and it's incredibly frustrating. One thing we're learning about Oswald is he actually was not easily provoked. When people were willing to get along with him, he got along with them. He was intelligent. He was friendly. He was an average down-home boy. And for this, he's apparently patient. He's, but he's also either stupid or brave. If he was intelligence and trying to get out of going to the other, I feel like they would have ordered him out of it. Maybe they said, hey, if you can get something in medical, then you can be around here. Otherwise, you're going to have to go with your group. I don't know. But to shoot yourself in the arm seems quite committed to the cause of staying. In early December, the Terrell County headed out into the South China Sea and rendezvoused with some 30 other ships of the 7th Fleet. For 30 or 40 days, we never saw land, Persons remembers. The rumor floated around that the Marines were to be sent into Thailand to rescue some American oil executives, but there was no official briefing for the enlisted men. Some Marines found relief from the boredom by trying to sink floating oil drums with rifle fire. There was no relief, however, from the sweltering sun. For hours on end, they had nothing to do but speculate on the forthcoming intervention and play chess and poker. Gator Daniels even taught Oswald, who had resisted gambling up to this point, how to play nickel and dime poker. Some of us were sorry we ever taught Oswald to play penny ante poker, Daniels recalls. He got real good at it. Then he added, he did a little growing up in that time. He started acting like a man. Finally, after a hot and dreary Christmas at sea, near the equator, the LST returned to Subic Bay. The Marines again went ashore with their equipment. This time they set up a temporary camp on the edges of Kubi Point Air Base. There, Coffee Hill celebrated a New Year's Eve that was raucous even by Marine standards. Persons was knocked unconscious, and a radar technician in the unit was hospitalized with a serious concussion. When asked if Oswald attended the party, Zach Stout replied, Ozzy would have walked a mile to stay away from anything like that. Boredom was rampant in the Philippines, and some of the men established a booze-making operation. Peter Cassisi recalls that the men stole alcohol from the sick bay and put it in a 5-gallon water can, along with a hearty mixture of orange and potato peelings. This brings to mind the scene from The Great Escape. Have you guys seen it, where they make their own vodka and that's what they celebrate, I think, Christmas with one year? The concoction was then buried for a week to ferment. After the can was dug up, they strained the mixture through their t-shirts. The stuff was so awful you actually had to hold your nose when you drank it, recalls Cassisi. A few weeks after the unit landed on January 15th, 1958, there was a violent incident at Kubi Point. Private Martin Shrand, who had traveled by car with Oswald from the aviation school at Jacksonville, Florida, to the radar school at Biloxi, Mississippi, and then to Atsugi and the Philippines, was shot to death while on guard duty. Persons was also on guard duty that night, patrolling an empty hangar, which on other occasions housed the blue-black U-2. He distinctly remembers hearing the whistle of the high winds off the South China Sea, which he had come to associate with Kubi Point. The officer of the day, Lieutenant Hugh Cherry, had just made his routine check of the guard. Suddenly, Persons heard an explosion, which he instantly knew was a shotgun blast, and blood-curdling screams from the area that Shrand was patrolling. The screams were like some wild thing. I knew I wasn't supposed to leave my post no matter what happened, but I just said, hell, the guy's in trouble, and took off over there, he later recounted. About 50 yards away, he found Shrand in a pool of blood, mortally wounded. His shotgun was about 6 feet away on the ground behind him. Lieutenant Cherry arrived a few minutes later, as did a medic. It was determined that Shrand had been shot under the right arm by his own shotgun. It was ruled out because the barrel of the gun was longer than Shrand's arm, and no object with which he could have pulled the trigger was found at the scene. At first, because of the distance of the shotgun from the body, it was assumed that he had been attacked by a Filipino guerrilla, and in the scuffle, shot with his own weapon. But when no other evidence of infiltrators could be found, the death was ruled accidental, on the assumption that the weapon had accidentally gone off when Shrand dropped it. The enlisted men, continuing to suspect that something more was involved with Shrand's death, grew increasingly nervous about guard duty. Parenthetically, we are told, the same day that Shrand was shot, Oswald took and passed an examination that made him eligible for promotion to corporal. There are end notes here. I don't know if you guys feel it. This story, the way he tells it, feels very conversational to me in a very appealing way. I like the way that he gives this information. This makes me want to dig much more. Interestingly, it seems like Edward J. Epstein really did his research. Here's the note for this whole chapter. It says on the source notes, it says, with one exception, all the quotes and descriptions in this chapter come from Marines who were interviewed for this book. The exception is the assertion that Oswald had met with communists in Japan. This comes from the testimony of George de Mohrenschildt. De Mohrenschildt later repeated this to me in an interview in March 1977. So interesting. Everything except for that assertion was from his fellow Marines. The only thing that wasn't was that communist Japan group assertion. It's just interesting. This is a totally different picture than I've ever been given, and I wonder if you're feeling the same thing. Peter Francis Connor had been on sentry duty just before Shrand, and he was called back to take the post after the shooting. I was really scared that night, Connor recalls 2 decades later. I knew something had happened, but nobody told me exactly. It was real dark, and I remember walking along and coming to the spot where he'd been shot. There was a big puddle of blood on the concrete, and I remember there was a bunch of Christmas candy in the middle of it. I guessed it had been blown out of his shirt pocket. It really got to me when I saw that candy. A few days after Shrand's death, Coffee Mill was again ordered to disband its camp. This time, the Marines boarded a Philippine LST and headed for the island of Corregidor, 40 miles away. There, they again set up their radar bubble and arranged sleeping quarters for themselves in the roofless remains of a hospital bombed out during World War II. Strewn all around the site was the debris of the fierce battles and bombardments of that war. So this would be 13 years after the fact. And they're just in an old bombed out building that hasn't been torn down, hasn't been fixed or rebuilt. Very interesting. A week or so after they set up camp, John Wayne, then in the midst of filming The Barbarian and the Geisha, flew overhead in a helicopter and asked permission to land. A moment later, the 6'4" film star was engulfed by Marines who rushed out of the radar hut to greet him. Oswald was on mess duty at the time for the 3rd straight month, and a photograph taken of Wayne dining with the men shows Oswald in the background. Yes, we do have that photo here, and I didn't even know about this until a month ago. You can see right here, I know it's a grainy photo, but I'll try to get my shadows out of the way and we'll just zoom in on it. You can see John Wayne is there facing the camera at the mess table, and back in the doorway is Lee Oswald. So there's a photo of Lee Oswald with John Wayne. Very interesting. This says unretouched photo. So it's a bad photo. You can see the streaks through it, but very fascinating. Wayne departed later that afternoon. During his 10 weeks on Corregidor, Oswald became a proficient cook, scrambling gallon after gallon of eggs each morning. Recalls George Wilkins, Ozzy really could put on a show with those eggs. He could have 3 gallons of eggs on the griddle and make a mess tray and slide it under the puddle of eggs and flip them all at once. It was quite a sight. Despite his continuing mess duty, Oswald seemed to enjoy himself on the island in his spare time, as did his fellow Marines. The men were responsible for little but their own entertainment. Sunday visits to the island by American tourists were virtually the only breaks in their routine of swimming, sunbathing, and exploring. In his letters from Corregidor, Persons had little to report except that his suntan was the best he'd ever had. Radar duty was so uneventful that the men practiced scanning for imaginary aircraft to avoid being driven crazy by the monotony. Zach Stout took long walks with Oswald, exploring the battle-scarred fortifications, and found him especially good company. Oswald knew the history of the island and would explain it to Stout. We'd see all these unexploded shells and tunnels, Stout recalls, and we'd go swimming every day, the clearest, cleanest water I'd ever seen. You could see the bombs still lying at the bottom. Their explorations of the island were temporarily discouraged when a native found and killed a 15-foot python in the jungle near the beach. Oswald spent most of the rest of his time reading serious books and waiting for letters. When he did receive mail, he would abruptly leave the friends he was with to read it in private. By March 7th, the Indonesia crisis had finally subsided, and the Marines boarded another LST, the USS Wexford County, with all their radar gear. It took another 11 days at sea before they reached their home base in Japan. Operation Strongback lasted 1 day short of 3 months. Something interesting about this is you don't hear them saying, he was a real squirrely guy who would be gone for 2 weeks. He'd go places we don't know. These are people who were interacting with him day after day during these months. And there is discrepancies about where was Lee Oswald during these times. According to this group of Marines, who sound to me like they know him very well, this sounds like a steady 3 months where they were having this boredom, exploring, swimming, teaching each other, how to play penny poker. It doesn't sound like there's even an opportunity for him to be engaged in ultra secret behavior at this time. They even describe him making eggs, and that he got good at it. It seems like he was doing his job and doing normal stuff. I don't know. You guys let me know if there's different information that you have about this time. Back at Atsugi, Oswald was brought up on charges for having had an unregistered weapon, the Derringer with which he had shot himself in October. The court-martial found him guilty as charged on April 11th, and he was sentenced to 20 days hard labor, forfeiture of $50 in pay, and reduction to the rank of private, thus nullifying his having passed the examination for corporal. His confinement was suspended for 6 months with the provision that it would be canceled if he kept out of further trouble. Moreover, even though his officers supported his request to be returned to radar duty, he was inexplicably kept on mess duty. So he wanted to go back to radar duty. He's kept on mess duty. It was at that point that Oswald put in for a hardship discharge. Apparently, he hoped to be discharged in Japan, where he had made friends, but this request also was turned down. Stout remembers that Oswald became increasingly bitter at this turn of events and began to argue that he was being singled out for mistreatment by the Marine Corps. Oswald finally took his resentment out on the man who had reassigned him to mess duty, Technical Sergeant Miguel Rodriguez. Rodriguez, a well-built Mexican-American from Texas, recalls Oswald swaggering over to him at a squadron party at the Enlisted Men's Club at Atsugi, looking at him with those small, dreamy eyes and saying, "You've got guts to come in here." Rodriguez ignored his challenge, suspecting at the time that Oswald was prejudiced against persons of Mexican descent. A few nights later, Rodriguez saw Oswald at the Bluebird Cafe, the local hangout for the Marines in Coffee Mill. This time, Oswald spilled a drink on Rodriguez and attempted to provoke a fight. The military police intervened, and the next day, Rodriguez signed a complaint against Oswald. Okay, so we have to ask ourselves, are we seeing a personality shift where he's gone from being this introvert who likes to read, he's exploring islands, things are totally fine? Is this a mental thing that's happening where he's all of a sudden trying to pick a fight with this one particular man? Or when he didn't get given his hardship discharge, is this a different way that he sees of just getting out somehow? Or is there something else going on? Is he trying to pursue intelligence work and going about it in a way that is under the radar? I don't know. In June, Oswald again faced a summary court-martial. At the hearing, Oswald elected to act as his own defense counsel, and by cross-examining Rodriguez, attempted to persuade the court that he had spilled the drink accidentally. Rodriguez insisted, and still insists, that Oswald had not been drunk, and that he had deliberately spilled his drink on him. The judge ruled that Oswald had used provoking words and sentenced him to 28 days in the brig and the forfeiture of another $55. Oswald began serving his sentence on July 27, 1958. Life in the Marine brig was designed to be punishing. Prisoners were not allowed to say a solitary word to one another. Except for sleeping and eating periods, the prisoners were made to stand at rigid attention during every moment they were not performing menial duties. The guards, or turnkeys, were especially brutal. When a prisoner had to use the toilet, he had to tow up to a red line and scream his request over and over again until the turnkey was satisfied and granted permission. One fellow Marine who was in the brig at the same time as Oswald described the brig as a horror, far worse than anything in civilian prisons. From his 9-man cell, he remembers seeing Oswald looking out from a single cell. He was standing there by the bars in civilian clothes. I laughed when I saw him, but we couldn't say anything. Oswald was released from the brig on August 13th. So that means he was in there for 16 days. He had been sentenced to 28, but he went in on July 27th and was released on August 13th. Joseph D. Macedo, another young radar operator in Coffee Mill, remembers meeting Oswald soon after he was released from the brig. He found him a completely changed person from the naive and innocent boy who had joined the unit in Japan less than a year earlier. Oswald was a non-drinker and virgin when he came overseas. Then, at the 6 to 7 o'clock happy hours in the evenings, Oswald began drinking mixed drinks with the men and became more extroverted and moderately humorous. Now, Macedo found him again to be cold, withdrawn, and bitter. "I've seen enough of a democratic society here in Max 1, Oswald said. "When I get out, I'm going to try something else." Oswald seemed to associate more than ever with his Japanese friends and less with Marines. He frequently went to Tokyo or otherwise disappeared on his passes. One of Oswald's Marine friends recalls meeting him at a house in Yamato with a woman who was working there as a housekeeper for a naval officer. He was impressed at the time that Oswald had found a girlfriend who was not a bar girl or prostitute. In the house was also a handsome young Japanese man, for whom Oswald had apparently bought a T-shirt from the PX on base. While the girls cooked sukiyaki on the hibachi grill, the men talked. But the Marine was unable to understand exactly what Oswald's relation was to the group. In September 1958, a new international crisis arose as Chinese communists began shelling and blockading the tiny offshore islands of Quemoy and Matsu, which were occupied by anti-communist troops loyal to the nationalist government on Formosa. In anticipation of a possible naval intervention held in the straits between Formosa and the communist-held mainland, Coffee Mill was ordered to set up a forward radar base at Pingtung on Formosa. Along with his fellow Marines, Oswald boarded the USS Skagit, an attack cargo ship. The trip from Japan to northern Formosa took more than a week. In Formosa, the officers commanding Coffee Mill found that its crucial squawk, or identification, friend or foe system, had been totally compromised. The communist Chinese seemed to know all the code signals, which, on one occasion, allowed them to penetrate air defenses and appear on the radar screens as friends rather than as foes. Interesting. Lieutenant Charles R. Rhodes, an air control officer from South Carolina, vividly recalls the communist Chinese jets breezing right through the IFF system. Someone with access to the squawk codes in the Parrot had apparently passed them along to the enemy. "We never knew how they got their planes through," Rhodes observed, "but they had all the signals. We really caught hell about that." When not on radar duty, the Marines also helped the nationalist Chinese troops build artillery emplacements. This, to Oswald, was further evidence of American imperialism. He told an American reporter 13 months later about his indignation at helping drag up guns for the Chinese and watching American technicians show the Chinese how to use them. He added, "It's one thing to talk about against communism, and another thing to drag a gun up a mountainside." Lieutenant Rhodes remembers Oswald from the first time he met him on Corregidor as somebody who looked real lonesome. Whenever possible, Rhodes explained, he tried to be friendly toward him because "I always figured that boy probably had trouble at home. I was born the baby of 6 kids in the middle of the Depression, and I knew how it felt to be down. Oswald looked like the kind of kid who got the hand-me-downs, just like I had. I even remember once that Oswald told me, 'Lieutenant Rhodes, you're the only officer who's ever been nice to me.'" Rhodes seemed to hold Oswald's respect, despite having to reprimand him severely on one occasion. "Oswald did a good job on radar," Rhodes recalled. "He was the type fella who liked a little attention and praise. He liked to be told when he was doing a good job, and I always tried to say something nice about his work." Then one evening, while Rhodes was in charge of the radar operations, he left the bubble for a few minutes, leaving Oswald at the plotting board. A superior officer happened to go into the bubble and found Oswald asleep at Rhodes' desk. "He didn't do anything to Oswald, but he sure gave me hell, and I had to give Oswald hell," Rhodes said. Oswald's excuse was that he had been on mess duty and was tired. One night, soon after they had arrived, Oswald was on guard duty at about midnight when Rhodes, the officer of the guard, suddenly heard 4 or 5 shots from the position Oswald was guarding. Drawing his .45 caliber pistol, he ran toward the clump of trees from which the gunfire seemingly emanated. There, he found Oswald slumped against a tree, holding an M1 rifle across his lap. "When I got to him, he was shaking and crying," Rhodes later recounted. "He said he had seen men in the woods and that he challenged them and then started shooting." Rhodes put his arm around Oswald's shoulder and slowly walked him back to his tent. He kept saying he just couldn't bear being on guard duty. Rhodes reported the incident to his commanding officer, and almost immediately after that, on October 6th, Oswald was returned to Japan on a military plane. Rhodes was not told any reason for this sudden action other than the official explanation that he was being sent to Atsugi for medical treatment. He had apparently contracted a mild case of gonorrhea, but this had been under treatment before he had shipped out for Formosa. Rhodes believed then, as he does today, that Oswald planned the shooting incident as a ploy to get himself sent back to Japan. Oswald liked Japan and wanted to stay. I don't know why, but he didn't want to go to Formosa, and I think he fired off his gun to get out of there. There was nothing dumb about Oswald. When Oswald reported to the base hospital in Atsugi, he complained of having injured himself doing heavy lifting in Formosa, but the only unambiguous symptoms the doctors were able to find were urethral discharges which had persisted from the gonorrhea. With his unit still overseas, Oswald was reassigned to the Marine Squadron at Iwakuni, an airbase some 430 miles southwest of Tokyo, which manned the Tactical Air Control Center for the Northern Pacific area. In the case of a communist Chinese, North Korean, or Soviet attack, it was the job of the center to coordinate the air defenses. This required that continual information about the availability of Allied aircraft throughout the Pacific be constantly fed to the center. At any given moment, the center had to be ready and able to scramble interceptors. On this temporary duty, Oswald again was assigned to the translucent plotting board. Owen Dejanovich, a tall, lanky native of Chicago who went on to play professional football, immediately recognized Oswald in the center as someone he had gone to radar school with at Keesler Air Base and tried to renew the acquaintanceship. He quickly found that Oswald had grown enormously bitter since he had last known him. He kept referring to the Marines at the center as "you Americans," as if he were some sort of foreigner simply observing what we were doing, says Dejanovich. His tone was definitely accusatory. He spoke in slogans about American imperialism and exploitation, which made Dejanovich think at the time that Oswald, whom he called Bugs, was merely being perverse for the sake of shocking the other Marines at the center. In the evenings, Dejanovich would occasionally see Oswald speaking to an attractive Eurasian woman. She was much too good-looking for Bugs, he recalls thinking, and he wondered why such an attractive round eye, who was obviously not a common bar girl, would waste her time with a Marine private. Another Marine in the unit, Dan Powers, had got the impression from Oswald that this Eurasian was half Russian and was teaching Oswald the Russian language. Other Marines speculated that Oswald had simply set up a ranch or a living arrangement with the Eurasian at Iwakuni. But whenever Dejanovich would see Oswald with this girl at the Orion Bar in Iwakuni, he would just shake his head at what he considered Oswald's perverse nature. Who but Oswald would come to Japan and find a round-eyed Russian girlfriend, he would ask himself. Unknown to his fellow Marines, Oswald was, during this period in Japan, making careful plans and preparations to defect to the Soviet Union. At least that is what he told reporters when he arrived in Moscow 1 year later. That is the end of our reading. Very insightful. I feel like I have such a better read on his personality. I feel really grateful that Epstein was able to talk to all of these Marines. I'd love to hear from you and what you think of this selection from Legend, The Secret World of Lee Harvey Oswald. What did you notice? His work ethic, his moodiness, the point at which things changed. Very interesting. I feel he did a great job. And I've heard of his writing that it reads like a novel. I would have to agree. I really enjoyed this reading. So I want to hear from you what you think. Next time we will come back and we will be looking at a classic book here in Texas, at least. It's called A Texan Looks at Lyndon, a study in illegitimate power. We're going to read a selection about how Lyndon felt about the presidency. A lot of this book is actually about his rise to power in Texas. It gives a really deep look at his background, but we're going to read the selection about how he felt about the presidency, how he was moving towards the presidency, and his mood and attitude right beforehand, so that we can get a look at the man, Lyndon Johnson, as he moves into the position of being JFK's vice president. So come back for that. I hope you enjoyed this one. We'll see you next time. Have a great day.